I'm going to talk again about good essays, and in particular about how to write a good essay, with a focus this time on questions of structure. It's worth again thinking about this question. We want to write a really good essay, so one of the things we need to think about is who is going to be reading it and how. So let's ask the question again. How does someone like me mark an essay? Well, one of the very obvious answers to that is as a reader. Of course we're assessing it. Of course we've got the marking criteria. But you pick it up and you read it through from beginning to end. And so this has to work as a piece of writing. It has to make sense from the beginning. You have to be able to pick it up, and the introduction has to draw you into the subject, lay things out for you, and then as a reader you need to be taken through, walked through the argument step by step before coming, we hope, to a clear conclusion. So you mark an essay as a reader, and it's worth you as a writer remembering that, because it can help you to make sure that you do the right things when you construct your essay. So bearing that in mind, part of what we need is, of course, something that's well written, clear and concise. We need something that is internally coherent, that you can pick up and that makes sense from beginning to end. Now, often, of course, your reader is going to be somebody who knows the topic very well. They've probably written the question and written the module. But don't assume too much information. Your essay has to make sense as a standalone piece of writing. Imagine that someone else, an intelligent historian, is picking this up, but that this isn't necessarily their subject specialism. And try and write for that person, making sure, therefore, that you introduce key themes, key terms, and that your essay makes sense in and of itself. Also, of course, in order to make the best possible impression on this particular reader, you need to make sure that your work is led by analysis. In other words, by explanation rather than description, that you've got a good argument. So how do you go about achieving that? Well, if we're thinking about how to write well, one point to make, which maybe seems a bit obvious, is that to write well, you need to read well and read a lot. And by read well, I mean read carefully, take good notes. It should go more or less without saying that writing a good essay requires a lot of preparation, lots of reading, lots of research and good note-taking. That's the basis. That provides you with the raw materials that you need to now shape and structure into your essay. How do you do that? Well, the fundamentals of what we do as historians is to move from the general to the particular and then back to the general. This is how we understand the structure of almost all of the writing that we do. Books are structured like this, articles are structured like this, and essays are structured like this. I'll tell you in a moment that I think many good paragraphs are structured like this as well. So we begin with general themes, with an overview, perhaps picking out some of the things that we're especially interested in. We then go into particular details, focusing in on those bits of evidence that we want our reader to really understand. And then we come back to the general again, perhaps linking back, though, as we conclude things and analyse, to some of those particular points that we thought were especially important. So moving from the general to the particular and back again is part of this heartbeat of how analysis tends to work. All of the articles, books that you read will be structured in some way like that. Almost anything you read and everything that you write will be structured in some way like this. So let's think then a little bit more about structure. What is this? Well, all writing needs organisation if it's going to make sense. It needs structure. And moving from the general to the particular and back is the essential element of structure for us in the humanities at university level. It's one of the key things that means that we can help our reader to avoid getting lost in detail, because we provide them with an overview, introduction, then we explain that detail, and then we bring it back into context. It means that you can always see the wood for the trees, and poorly written pieces of work are those pieces of work that leave you scratching your head because lots of detail is been thrown in, but it lacks organisation, it lacks order, it doesn't have the kind of structure that's necessary for you to make sense of all of that detail. So structure and argument are two things that go really closely together. So let's remember what an argument is. Essentially, the argument is your explanation of the topic or question. And your arguments are going to be central to the organisation of your essay. All of the specific elements of your essay, introduction, paragraphs, conclusion, need to help contextualise, support, and to explain your argument. So one important part of structure and argument is the introduction, the analysis, and the conclusion, otherwise known popularly as the beginning, middle, and end of a piece of writing, so not rocket science. And there's this useful quote from Marius and Page, who've written a really useful book for people like you, writing history essays at university. They say that the first and last paragraphs of a good essay reflect some of the same words and thoughts. You can read these paragraphs and have a pretty good idea of what the intervening essay is about. So it's pretty obvious, isn't it, that an essay has a structure like that, beginning, middle, and end. And that's obvious, you're taught that at school. One of the things, though, that is really important to understand as a student at university is that although some of the things that you learned about writing essays at school are going to continue to be useful to you, there are things that are different about writing at this level, and you have to be prepared to learn new things. You even have to be prepared to tear up some of the old things that you learned about essay writing in order to be freer and more intellectually autonomous, writing the kind of work that we need to see at university. So just as an essay has a structure, I want you to understand that paragraphs have structure as well. So a paragraph is not just a whole heap of information about a specific topic. A paragraph needs to do certain kinds of work. It needs to introduce a point, illustrate it with evidence or examples, and then provide an analysis that helps to drive your argument forward. So, one of the things that I've learned over the years is that to help you to write analytically, you can set yourself a rule that except in really exceptional circumstances, all paragraphs in the main body of an essay should contain those elements that you can see in front of you: point, example, and analysis. You could even take that a little bit further and decide that the first sentence of most of the paragraphs that you write should make a point that helps you to answer the question. So let's take an example. Let's say that we were answering a question about how the American Revolution began. We've done lots of reading about this, and it's led us to the idea, it's led us to the argument that the revolution began with the disputes of the 1760s. And we want to make a point about the importance of the Stamp Act of 1765. Which of those sentences opposite should we choose to start our paragraph about that, do you think? Take a look at those two sentences and take a moment, pause it if you like, and decide which you'd prefer. Now, either of those sentences could be fine. A skilled historian could start their paragraph with either of those sentences and make sure that the paragraph did its work of analysis. But I think, on the whole, for an undergraduate essay, that first one is better, because it's making an explanatory point, and so it really underlines for a reader where this paragraph is going in terms of the argument of the essay. And it also helps you as a writer to make sure you stay on the track of analysis and explanation and don't get drawn away into simply trying to tell the story. So we've chosen that as our first sentence. How could we carry on a paragraph? Well, we've got a point now. Colonial American loyalties to Britain were severely tested by the Stamp Act. Let's add some examples. So you could go on along these lines. Protests began soon after Prime Minister Grenville introduced this legislation in 1765. There were protests in America. In Boston there were popular protests and a mob attacked and looted the home of the governor. Often that's the bit of a paragraph where you'll need a footnote, because you'll want to explain to your reader, you want to give your reader a reference to show where you've got that information from. But that on its own is not going to do the whole job of analysis, of driving your argument forward. So you need to do a little bit more to tie those things together. So a way that you could finish this paragraph is by saying something like, the imperial legislation attempting to impose a direct tax on the colonies therefore prompted mass protests in America. The sort of colonial resentment expressed at Boston was so severe that it continued to shape relations between the metropole and colonies in the years that followed. Glossing that evidence and linking it back to the point that you want to make, and then driving your analysis forward for whatever comes next in your essay. Those things too might also require a footnote. That's a judgment that you need to make as you write. So there you go. That's one incredibly simple example to illustrate how you can move from the general to the particular and back in a paragraph. From a general point through particular examples back into more general analysis. Paragraphs that you write in your essays might well be much more sophisticated than this. You might want to be using, for example, quotations that you've found from primary evidence, the sort of thing that really helps to show a marker that you've got the skills necessary for high marks. You might also want to be mentioning some other historians, the ways in which your analysis links to or even contradicts theirs, the sort of engagement with historiography that also can really impress markers and help you to get the higher marks. The thing to remember about structure is that you have to make words work. The words that you read and that you write and type are not just saying things. They're always doing some kind of specific work. They're putting together the ideas and evidence that you're constructing into an interpretation. So when you write, think about that at every step. Think about it as you plan. Think about it as you write your introduction, each of your paragraphs, even individual sentences, making sure that all of those words are working for you, helping to convey in a clear way your argument to the reader. Clearly, as I said at the very beginning, doing well at history requires knowledge and understanding of the past, the sort of thing that you're going to derive mostly from your reading. But it also requires you to write well, to control and to structure your ideas and your evidence. So let's finish with a couple of points about good university level essays. When you start writing history, there are lots of constraints. I'm thinking particularly about writing at school. You're heavily guided as to what you can or should write and how to organise your ideas. Now that can be comfortable, it can be safe, and it can also be quite enjoyable, but before long that becomes quite limiting. At university, things are different. Lots of those constraints are lifted. A key thing to remember about how your work is assessed is that your marker wants to see evidence of intellectual autonomy, that you can think for yourself. So you're expected to make more decisions for yourself, and to do well you have to be more independent. There are far fewer strict constraints at this level. But every week you're going to come across examples of history writing. So use your daily reading then, not only to learn about the past and its interpretation, but also to explore examples that can help you to write good history. Think about how the authors that you're reading are introducing their work, are setting up their arguments. How are they structuring their paragraphs or introducing evidence and explaining it to you in order to try to develop their argument? It's in that way, learning from other practitioners, including those who are above your current level, that is really necessary in order to improve and write the very best essays that you can at this particular level.